Satoshi Nakamoto, the enigmatic person or persons who created Bitcoin, has been quoted as saying that e-currency transactions can be secure and effortless without the need to trust a third-party middleman, such as a government or central bank. What it requires is secure individual transactions and verifiable record-keeping capability in the e-money exchange system. But Augustine Carstens doesn't agree. Carstens is the head of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, and he's a former deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund. So he knows a thing or two about money. Carstens says that Bitcoin is a combination of a bubble, a Ponzi scheme, and an environmental disaster. So who's right? Are cryptocurrencies a better form of money that will eventually displace government-issued currencies? Or are they a speculative toy, like some of the old dot-com turned dot-bomb stocks? And are they an impending financial or environmental disaster? The environmental reference relates to the immense computing power and all the implied activity at coal-fired power plants required to operate Bitcoin, about 32 terawatts of electricity a year, enough to power 5.4 million US households, according to the Digiconomist website. To find some answers to these questions, we should dig into the history of cryptocurrencies and the nuts and bolts of how they work. We also ought to look for insight into the field of financial economics, especially market development, one of my main interests. In April 2013, 7 cryptocurrencies circulated with a market value of $1.6 billion, according to the widely quoted source CoinMarketCap.com. By January 2018, more than 1,300 cryptocurrencies traded with a market value of nearly $824 billion, before an abrupt market correction wiped out more than 2/3 of the market's value. The most important lesson I've learned from studying financial markets over the years is that markets develop and innovate out of necessity. That is, successful new products and services are created when existing products and institutions don't provide us with all the choices we want. So we devise new ones, and this was the case with Bitcoin. And the driving force was as much political as financial. Most of us take for granted the government's role in the creation and regulation of money. We might like the fact that the government stands behind the US dollar. But there's always been a libertarian school of thought, which argues that money should be privately provided and regulated instead. And this debate has profoundly affected the history of the monetary system in the United States. The US didn't have a central bank for most of its first 150 years of existence. Even when the Federal Reserve System was created in 1913, it was decentralized, at least in part to better respond to local needs. Now, the libertarian view is that money should be privately issued and circulated beyond the influence and control of government. Libertarians also want money to feature anonymity, so that people can buy and sell what they want without being spied on, and not be prosecuted because of their choices. Still, all money needs to deliver 3 basic services. It must first maintain its value over time, second, be universally accepted as payment for goods and services, and third, function as a way to measure earnings, expenses, debts, and assets. Of these requirements, the 2 most important to libertarian thinkers are that money maintain its value and its anonymity. The belief is that if a currency achieves these 2 characteristics, value and anonymity, it will also be attractive for making purchases, loans, and investments. Given these qualifiers, gold seems like an obvious alternative. But it's too impractical, especially for long-distance transactions. Other problems, like security, also make gold a costly substitute for currency. Still, with the advent of the internet and advances in cryptography to make electronic messages secure, as well as to obscure the sender's identities, gold did get a new chance to become the standard for private money. This was through a venture called e-gold. A former oncologist named Douglas Jackson in Melbourne, Florida, started e-gold in 1996. His company sold gold and other precious metals at a 5% markup over market prices to anyone. But rather than deliver the physical commodity, eGold issued electronic claim checks to its customers. In turn, the account holder could make electronic payments to anyone else who had an eGold account. And these electronic claim checks were always completely backed by bullion or coins in eGold's vaults. The company started to take off in about 2000, and by 2005, it had 3.5 million customer accounts in 165 countries, second only to PayPal in handling online payments, though a distant second. But while eGold accounts were anonymous, the company couldn't be. And this made it vulnerable to government regulators, who discovered that some eGold customers used its electronic claim check system to launder money and run investment scams. The FBI and the Secret Service raided eGold in December 2005, and Jackson and the firm pleaded guilty to crimes connected to money laundering and operating an unlicensed money transmission service. eGold's essential design flaw, with respect to the libertarian goal of anonymity, was to incorporate a central institution into the operation. Without its servers hosting accounts and verifying payments, and without its vault storing the bullion, there was no product. But that also made it vulnerable to that nemesis of libertarians, government interference and regulation, thereby defeating its purpose as a private currency. So, back to the drawing board. A truly anonymous currency must come with some way of tracking ownership and making transfers without a central institution to oversee these accounts and transactions. And the currency has to find a way to maintain its value. These are difficult requirements. Jackson later tried to recreate eGold in full compliance with financial regulations, but it never took off. Still, plenty of libertarian-leaning computer programmers were up for the challenge. In 2008, a white paper released under the name of Satoshi Nakamoto described the system known as Bitcoin, followed by the supporting computer code. And in January 2009, Nakamoto mined the first coins, bringing Bitcoin into existence. Mining is the process of spending computer power to process transactions, secure the network, and keep the system synchronized. Agents who perform these activities are rewarded with new Bitcoins, hence they're miners. Most knowledgeable observers are convinced that Satoshi Nakamoto is a pseudonym. But to this day, nobody knows the true identity of the person or persons who created the code. Within a few years, Nakamoto basically disappeared from the web. By this time, however, Bitcoin was becoming an established electronic money. And while its design is far from perfect, it achieves the two main goals of a private currency. First, supply limitations help Bitcoins retain value. Nakamoto established a hard upper limit of 21 million Bitcoins. And the rate at which new Bitcoins are created is also restricted. On average, about 25 new Bitcoins are created every 10 minutes. In the future, that number will fall by half each time a certain number of transactions is reached. It should take until about 2140 to mine all 21 million Bitcoins. In addition, Bitcoin users remain anonymous without the need for a central institution to keep transactions secure. Nakamoto achieved this by combining two standard cryptographic techniques, a public-private key system and cryptographic hash functions. The public-private key secures payment instructions. Users exchange these instructions via coded digital signatures. The hash function is embedded in the record of all transactions in a way that immediately reveals whether any part of the record has been tampered with. Let me explain this in more detail, since it takes us to the heart of the innovation of Bitcoin, the blockchain. A cryptographic hash function is a computer program that takes a set of data and makes a label for it, called a hash. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies use these hashes to establish tamper-resistant public records. Each hash looks like a string of random characters, though it really isn't random, and each has a fixed length. Different data sets can be assigned to the same hash, but so long as the hash is long enough, finding an alternative data set with that same hash is computationally demanding and time-consuming. Now let's examine how these cryptographic hashes are used to make the record of payment instructions tamper-proof. Each payment message broadcast to the network is verified using the public-private key, and each valid message is bundled into a list called a block. The maker of the block, a Bitcoin miner, will write an introduction to this list called a header. The miner places the hash of the most recently created valid block in the header of the block he or she is writing. So each block in the chain starts off with key information about the previous block, hence the term blockchain. The blockchain is tamper-proof in the following sense. You can select any block in the chain and feed this dataset into the hash function to calculate its hash. If the resulting hash doesn't match the hash written into the header of the next block, then at least one block has been tampered with, and we should discard one or both. The miners who built the blocks have an incentive to check the validity of each payment message and each block because they're rewarded with new Bitcoins for each new valid block they add. But they must compete against all other miners for the right to add new blocks to the blockchain by solving puzzles based on hash functions. The problems are basically in the form of find a 256-character string of letters and numbers that has a hash value less than this number. The target number, by the way, gets smaller as more blocks are added, making the problem that much more difficult to solve. Bitcoin miners use powerful electricity-guzzling computers to guess solutions to these problems. Each coin requires several $1,000s worth of electricity to operate the computers that mine it. The high rates of energy consumption underscore why Augustine Carstens and others refer to Bitcoin as an environmental disaster. And is it really that secure? If we consider only the blockchain, the honest answer is probably. Enormous amounts of computing power and coordination would be required to forge bogus blocks and have them successfully added to the blockchain. And that's what you'd have to do to steal other people's Bitcoins. So as of now, the system is tamper-resistant. But we should never say never, especially when it comes to technology. And some other components of the Bitcoin system are much less secure than the blockchain. For example, individual Bitcoin accounts remain private only if their holders are careful with their passwords. And Bitcoin exchanges, where Bitcoins are bought and sold, have been notoriously easy to hack into. These issues aside, Bitcoin was a breakthrough in terms of achieving the libertarians' ideal of private money that governments couldn't interfere with. So it became a currency of choice for people who were suspicious of centralized authority or who wanted to avoid outside interference with their business. For example, Bitcoin facilitated the creation of the online black market known as Silk Road, which was a platform for selling illegal drugs and other illicit services. Like any successful product, Bitcoin inspired imitators. And because its inner workings were open to the public, many newcomers simply tweaked Bitcoin's code and gave their currencies different names. There are more than 1,500 cryptocurrencies today. But users and programmers also began to realize that Bitcoin's best feature is its blockchain architecture. Government-provided money, especially electronic money routed through the traditional banking system like credit and debit card payments, remains faster and cheaper to use. By comparison, paying with Bitcoin incurs relatively high transaction fees and takes time to verify. So I would say that the only compelling reason to use Bitcoins is as a speculative investment, or for making transactions you don't want the government to trace. Indeed, its suitability for speculation likely contributed to Bitcoin's inclusion, at least in name, in a multitude of entrepreneurial ventures, some of which were fraudulent, and also in its bubble-like run-up in market value in 2017 and early 2018. Putting the greater fool theory into practice, some people bought Bitcoins expecting that bigger fools would pay even more for them in the future. This is why Augustine Carstens referred to Bitcoin as a combination of bubble and Ponzi scheme. On the other hand, Carstens didn't give enough credit to the blockchain technology underpinning Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Blockchain technology could also be used to verify that the salmon you grill for dinner was actually caught in the wild by a ship that was complying with fishing regulations and prepared following proper worker safety and food handling practices. In addition, Blockchains could even contain language outlining a fully developed contract, along with instructions to execute and enforce the contract under a variety of circumstances. As an example, another cryptocurrency, Ethereum, is based on a blockchain architecture permitting so-called smart contracts to be embedded in its blocks. This raises the possibility of creating self-activating and self-enforcing contracts of all kinds, perhaps even ones that could back an electronic currency with claims on real assets, like e-gold. In short, blockchain technology has immense promise to change and improve the way that businesses and governments operate. But in my opinion, cryptocurrencies are among the least useful applications of this technology. I wouldn't be surprised if they eventually fade from popularity like so many other investment fads and bubbles. In my view, many of us would be better off taking our money out of the cryptocurrencies and betting on blockchain technology instead.